The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Miguel Sandoval's weathered face as he stood before the crumbling stone structure that had consumed his last dollar. The former temple, abandoned for over 2 centuries in the remote hills of northern New Mexico, looked more like a pile of rubble than the investment opportunity the county auction had promised. Its walls were blackened by fire, its wooden roof long collapsed into the nave, and thick vines choked what remained of the arched doorways. "You're a fool, Miguel," his neighbor Carlos had said that morning. $1 or not, you've bought yourself nothing but a headache and a pile of rocks. Miguel couldn't entirely disagree. At 53, he'd spent 3 decades working other men's land, saving every spare penny while watching wealthier ranchers expand their holdings. When the county announced the auction for the abandoned mission, he'd seen it as his only chance to own property, even if that property was little more than a historical ruin. The winning bid of $1 had seemed like destiny. Now, standing in the lengthening shadows with a shovel in his calloused hands, destiny felt more like desperation. The temple dated back to 1680, according to the faded placard still hanging on one partially intact wall. Built by Spanish missionaries, it had served as a religious outpost during the colonial period until the Pueblo Revolt drove the Spanish from the region. When they returned years later, they'd never rebuilt this particular mission. Local legend said it had been purposely abandoned, though no one remembered why. Miguel began the slow work of clearing debris from what had once been the main chapel. He had no grand plans for restoration. He couldn't afford them, even if he'd wanted them. His goal was simpler: clear enough space to build a small dwelling where he could finally live on land that belonged to him. The stones from the temple walls would provide building materials. The location, remote though it was, offered water from a nearby spring and enough flat land for a modest garden. As he worked, his shovel struck something solid beneath a collapsed section of floor. The metallic ring echoed through the empty space, making him pause. Miguel knelt down, brushing away centuries of accumulated dirt and ash. His fingers traced the outline of what appeared to be an iron ring set into a stone slab. His heart quickened. The slab was roughly 4 feet square, far too deliberately placed to be ordinary flooring. Miguel cleared the area around it, revealing that the stone bore faint carvings, symbols he couldn't decipher, and what looked like a date: 1680, the year of the Pueblo Revolt. Miguel gripped the iron ring and pulled. The stone didn't budge. He tried again, bracing his feet against the uneven floor, putting his full weight into the effort. Still nothing. The slab had been sealed for over 300 years, and it wasn't going to surrender easily. He fetched a crowbar from his truck and worked the edge into the seam around the stone. Minutes of sweating effort finally produced a grinding sound as the slab shifted slightly. Encouraged, Miguel repositioned the bar and tried again. This time, the stone lifted an inch, then 2. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the musty scent of earth and something else, old paper perhaps, or cloth. With a final heave, Miguel slid the stone aside. Beneath it lay a narrow stone stairway descending into darkness. Miguel's hands trembled as he retrieved a flashlight from his truck. Part of him wanted to call someone, the County Historical Society perhaps, or the university in Santa Fe. But another part, the part that had spent a lifetime watching opportunities slip away to those with more money or better connections, made him descend those stairs alone. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders. He counted 15 steps before reaching a small chamber, no larger than a bedroom, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the temple. The flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing something that made his breath catch. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked 3 high. In the center of the chamber sat a large trunk bound with iron straps. Everything was remarkably well preserved, protected by the dry air and constant temperature of the underground space. Miguel approached the nearest crate and pried off the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay dozens of leather-bound volumes. He carefully extracted one and opened it, squinting at the faded Spanish text on pages yellowed with age. His Spanish was rudimentary, learned from his grandmother, but he could make out enough words to understand he was looking at some kind of official record. The date on the first page read Junio 1680. June 1680, just months before the Pueblo Revolt. Miguel opened another volume, then another. Each contained meticulous records written in a careful hand, lists of names, amounts of gold and silver, dates of collection, and locations throughout New Spain. As he examined more books, a disturbing pattern emerged. These weren't ordinary church records. They documented systematic taxation, forced labor, and the seizure of indigenous peoples' property and resources. But it was what he found in the central trunk that truly shook him. The trunk contained actual treasures, gold chalices, silver candlesticks, ornate crosses encrusted with gems, and bags of coins bearing the Spanish royal seal. Beneath these obvious valuables lay something even more significant, a leather portfolio tied with cord. Miguel's hands shook as he untied the portfolio and removed its contents. Inside were official documents bearing the seal of the Spanish crown. Even with his limited Spanish, the words encomienda, tributo, and oro appeared repeatedly. More troubling were the signatures at the bottom, names of high-ranking colonial officials and religious authorities. One document in particular caught his attention. It bore the signature of someone identified as gobernador and detailed specific orders regarding the secure preservation of all records pertaining to tribute collection and labor allocation, to be hidden from inspection should hostile forces threaten the mission. Miguel sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He was holding evidence of what appeared to be systematic exploitation and abuse during the Spanish colonial period, records that someone in authority had ordered hidden just before the Pueblo revolt. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were proof of crimes committed in the name of the crown and the church, evidence that powerful people had deliberately concealed. The implications were staggering. This discovery could rewrite historical narratives about the Spanish colonial period in New Mexico. It could provide indigenous communities with documented evidence of the abuses their ancestors had suffered. It could be worth millions to collectors and museums, and it all belonged to Miguel Sandoval, the poor farmer who'd bought a ruined temple for $1. He spent the next 2 hours carefully examining everything in the chamber, taking notes and photographs with his old phone. The more he discovered, the more he understood why these records had been hidden. They documented forced conversions, brutal punishments for those who resisted, the systematic stripping of indigenous wealth, and the use of slave labor to extract precious metals from local mines. One ledger contained a detailed accounting of gold and silver seized from Pueblo communities, with notations indicating how much went to the crown, how much to the church, and how much various officials kept for themselves. Another recorded the names of indigenous people forced into labor, including children, with matter-of-fact notes about deaths and injuries. The treasure itself, Miguel realized, wasn't just valuable artifacts. Much of it had been stolen from the very people the missionaries claimed to be saving. As evening approached, Miguel carefully climbed back up the stairs. He replaced the stone slab. Though he didn't seal it, he'd need to return. Back in the open air, he sat on a fallen pillar and tried to organize his chaotic thoughts. The responsible thing would be to report the discovery immediately. Archaeologists should document everything properly. Indigenous communities deserved to know about these records. Museums would want the artifacts. But Miguel had lived long enough to know how these things worked. Once he reported the discovery, lawyers would appear, claiming the find belonged to the state or the federal government or the Catholic Church. Historians would take over, publishing papers and building careers on his discovery, while he received, at most, a footnote and perhaps a small finder's fee. The wealthy would profit as they always did, while Miguel remained poor. He thought about his neighbor, Carlos, about the ranchers who'd looked down on him his entire life, about the decades of back-breaking work that had left him with nothing but calloused hands and an aching back. He thought about his late wife, Maria, who died 5 years ago without ever living in a home they owned. He thought about his daughter Rosa, working 2 jobs in Albuquerque to support her 3 children after her husband left. For once, fortune had smiled on Miguel Sandoval. Was it wrong to want something for himself? Over the next week, Miguel continued clearing the temple during the day, while spending his evenings researching colonial Spanish history, archaeological law, and the art market. He learned that many similar discoveries had resulted in lengthy legal battles, with the original finder often receiving nothing. He also learned that certain items, particularly documents proving historical crimes, could be extremely valuable to specific buyers, though selling them would raise questions about their provenance. Miguel found himself trapped between moral duty and personal need, between doing what was right and doing what would finally give him security after a lifetime of poverty. The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after his discovery, Miguel received a visit from Thomas Whitehorse, a member of the nearby Pueblo community. Thomas was a respected elder who also worked as a cultural consultant for the State Historical Society. He'd heard through the local grapevine that Miguel had bought the old mission and was curious about the property. As they walked the grounds, Miguel found himself drawn to the older man's quiet wisdom. Thomas spoke about the history of the mission, about the uprising that had destroyed it, and about the continued impact of colonialism on indigenous communities. "My ancestors burned this place," Thomas said, gesturing at the blackened walls, "not out of hatred for God, but out of desperation. The priests and soldiers had taken everything, our land, our labor, our children, our sacred objects. They wrote their version of history, painting us as savages rebelling against civilization, but they never recorded what they did to provoke that rebellion." Miguel felt the weight of the documents hidden beneath their feet. What if there was proof? He asked carefully. "Documented evidence of what really happened?" Thomas looked at him sharply. "What have you found?" Miguel hesitated only a moment before deciding. He led Thomas down into the hidden chamber. The elder's reaction was everything Miguel had imagined. Thomas moved through the space in stunned silence, carefully examining documents with tears streaming down his weathered face. He read passages aloud in Spanish, his voice breaking with emotion. "Do you know what this means?" Thomas finally said. "These are the records they destroyed everywhere else. This is proof of what our elders passed down in oral histories, stories the colonizers dismissed as exaggerations or lies. This validates everything." "I don't know what to do with it," Miguel admitted. "I'm nobody. If I report this, lawyers and governments will take it all, but it's your history, your people's suffering documented here. It doesn't feel right for me to profit from it." Thomas sat on one of the crates, still holding a ledger that listed members of his own ancestral community. The Spanish crown tried to hide this because they knew the truth would condemn them. For over 300 years, their secret stayed buried. Now you've uncovered it. They talked for hours, Thomas reading passages aloud and explaining their significance. The documents told a story of systematic abuse that the official histories had whitewashed. They proved that the Pueblo revolt hadn't been an unprovoked attack by savages, but a desperate response to intolerable oppression. "Here's what I think," Thomas finally said. "This discovery belongs to history, but you're the one who found it. You took a chance on a property nobody else wanted. That means something. But these records need to be shared properly, not locked away in some private collection." Over the following weeks, Thomas helped Miguel develop a plan. They brought in a lawyer specializing in cultural heritage law, along with archaeologists who could properly document the find. They contacted representatives from multiple Pueblo communities and historians from several universities. The announcement of the discovery made national news. The hidden chamber beneath the old mission became one of the most significant archaeological finds related to the Spanish colonial period in North America. The documents provided irrefutable evidence of exploitation and abuse, forcing a reassessment of the historical narrative. But Miguel insisted on conditions. The artifacts and documents would be shared among indigenous communities and museums, not sold to private collectors. Copies of all documents would be made freely available to researchers and the public. Most importantly, the story would be told from the perspective of those who'd suffered, not the colonizers who'd committed the crimes. In exchange, Miguel received a significant finder's fee from the state, along with a consulting position, helping to interpret and preserve the discovery. It wasn't the fortune he might have gotten selling everything on the black market, but it was enough to build a proper home on his property and ensure his daughter Rosa could quit one of her jobs. More importantly, Miguel had helped give voice to the voiceless. The documents he'd found provided indigenous communities with concrete evidence to support land claims, cultural preservation efforts, and educational initiatives. Schools across the Southwest began teaching a more accurate version of colonial history. Thomas Whitehorse worked with Miguel to transform the old mission into a cultural center and museum. The hidden chamber became the centerpiece of an exhibition about colonial exploitation and indigenous resistance. Visitors descended the same stairs Miguel had first explored, experiencing the sense of discovery before learning the full story of what the Spanish crown had tried to hide. On the day the center officially opened, Miguel stood beside Thomas, looking at the crowds gathered to witness history. Journalists interviewed indigenous elders about their ancestors' suffering, now validated by written records. Students examined copies of the documents, learning truths that had been buried for centuries. Archaeologists discussed the significance of the find with historians. A reporter approached Miguel. "How does it feel, knowing that your $1 purchase led to one of the most important historical discoveries of the decade?" Miguel thought about the question carefully. "I was looking for a place to build a home," he finally said. "Instead, I found a story that needed to be told. Sometimes the poorest among us end up holding the richest truths." As the sun set over the old mission, no longer a ruin but a monument to truth and reconciliation, Miguel reflected on his journey. He'd started with nothing but $1 and a desperate hope. He'd found treasure beyond imagining. But the real wealth wasn't in the gold and silver that now resided in museums. It was in the knowledge that he'd helped reveal a truth powerful people had tried to hide forever. The Spanish crown had buried these secrets to protect their reputation and justify their conquest. Miguel Sandoval, the poor farmer they would have considered beneath notice, had brought those secrets into the light. In doing so, he'd proven that justice and truth don't belong to the powerful. They belong to whoever has the courage to claim them. Miguel built his home near the cultural center, living out his years as a respected guardian of the discovery he'd made. He never became wealthy by conventional standards, but he'd found something more valuable: purpose, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing he'd made a difference. The temple he'd bought for $1 had given him more than he'd ever dreamed possible, not through the treasure it contained, but through the truth it had helped him reveal. And every time he descended those stairs to give tours or consult with researchers, Miguel remembered that afternoon when his shovel struck that iron ring. It had been the sound of destiny calling, though not in the way he'd expected. He'd been searching for land to call his own. Instead, he'd found a buried history that belonged to everyone, and in sharing it, he'd finally found where he truly belonged.